the Mega-IPO Hail Mary, turning tech's future promise into present GDP support. When consumption, government spending, and net exports weaken, investment is the only growth engine left. Flint West reporting. Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a point in every debt cycle when the arithmetic stops being polite. The story stops being about politics, stops being about personalities, stops being about who tweeted what, and becomes a story about math. The United States currently finds itself staring directly at one of the most important equations in economics. GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. The problem? 3 of those 4 engines are beginning to sputter, and that leaves only one still running. Investment. The entire growth story increasingly rests on the letter I. Section 1. Let's start with consumption. Consumption has always been the heavyweight champion of the American economy, nearly 70% of GDP, the giant, the workhorse, the beast that carries everything else. But the beast is getting tired. May 2026 inflation came in at 4.2% year over year, the highest reading since 2023. Energy prices surged 23.5% amid geopolitical turmoil and supply disruptions. Every extra dollar spent filling a fuel tank is a dollar that isn't being spent somewhere else. Real purchasing power gets squeezed, households feel poorer, and eventually consumption begins to slow. Not collapse, not disappear, just contribute less. And when 70% of the economy starts contributing less, people should pay attention. Section 2. Then we arrive at government spending. For years, government spending has acted as the shock absorber. Whenever growth weakened, Washington spent. Whenever markets panicked, Washington spent. Whenever the economy stumbled, Washington spent. But today, the fiscal room is shrinking. The fiscal year 2026 deficit sits near $1.9 trillion, roughly 5.8% of GDP. Debt held by the public has already crossed 100% of GDP, and now proposed defense spending for fiscal year 2027 approaches $1.5 trillion. Government spending can still support growth. But every additional dollar increasingly arrives attached to another dollar of borrowing. And borrowing becomes more expensive when debt service costs are already exploding. The engine still runs, but it is running hotter. And hotter engines eventually develop problems. Section 3. Then we arrive at net exports, the forgotten child of the GDP equation. The United States continues to import more than it exports. The current account deficit remains a structural feature of the system. Attempts to rebalance trade have produced limited results. The trade gap narrows, then widens, then narrows again. But the broader pattern remains intact. America consumes more than it produces, and the difference must be financed by foreign capital. The arithmetic never disappears. It merely changes costume. This content is brought to you by Bobby Giggs. Promote your brand here and reach a wide audience across platforms like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Follow the links in the description to get started. Section 4. Which brings us to the final engine, investment. The last engine standing. And right now it is carrying a remarkable amount of weight. Business investment in equipment, business investment in intellectual property, business investment in artificial intelligence, data centers, semiconductors, energy infrastructure, cloud computing, automation, robotics. The AI build-out has become one of the most important economic stories on Earth, because when consumption weakens, government becomes constrained, and net exports remain negative. Investment becomes the growth engine of last resort. Section 5. And this is where the Mega-IPO Hail Mary enters the picture. The SpaceX IPO raised $75 billion, the largest IPO in history. Valuation approaching $1.8 trillion. At first glance, it looks like a capital markets event, a Wall Street story, a rich people's story. But beneath the surface, something more important is happening. Foreign investors exchange their euros, their yen, their pounds, their savings for American assets. Capital flows into the United States. Confidence flows into the United States. Dollar demand flows into the United States. The result? Roughly 8% of a recent quarterly current account deficit refinanced in a single day. That is not merely a stock market story. That is a macroeconomic event. Section 6. And SpaceX may not be alone. Anthropic, OpenAI, and whatever follows next. Each potential IPO represents another opportunity to transform future technological promise into present economic support. These offerings generate capital inflows, fund future investment, create wealth effects, support market confidence, and reinforce the perception that tomorrow's productivity gains are worth financing today. In essence, they monetize optimism today to support growth tomorrow. Section 7. Why does this matter? Because the debt math is becoming increasingly sensitive. Debt to GDP exceeds 100%. Interest expenses continue rising, and the critical variable becomes what economists call the RG differential, the difference between interest rates and economic growth. When growth exceeds financing costs, debt remains manageable. When financing costs exceed growth, the mathematics become increasingly unforgiving. Higher inflation pushes interest rates higher. Energy shocks push inflation higher. Supply chain duplication pushes costs higher. Geopolitical fragmentation pushes costs higher. Everything points toward pressure on rates, which means growth must work even harder just to stand still. Section 8. And unfortunately, the headwinds are not confined to America. Japan is raising rates. The carry trade faces pressure. Europe is tightening into an energy shock. Canada has already slipped into recessionary territory. Chinese capital flows face increasing restrictions. Petrodollar recycling has weakened amid disruptions surrounding the Strait of Hormuz. Strategic reserves are being drained around the world. The tide that lifted everything is no longer rising as easily as it once did. Section 9. This is why the current strategy feels so important and so fragile. The United States is effectively making a wager. Not on the past, not on the present, but on the future. A wager that artificial intelligence delivers meaningful productivity gains. A wager that automation lowers costs. A wager that frontier technologies create enough real economic output to justify today's valuations. A wager that tomorrow arrives before today's debt arithmetic becomes overwhelming. And to be fair, the wager is not irrational. What are the alternatives? Fiscal consolidation? Politically difficult. Trade rebalancing? Structurally difficult. Consumption-led growth? Inflation is making that difficult. So policymakers, investors, and markets increasingly find themselves gravitating toward the same conclusion. Investment must work, technology must work, productivity must work, because the other engines are no longer carrying their historical share of the load. So perhaps the most honest way to describe this moment is simple. America is attempting to convert future technological promise into present GDP support. The mega-IPO wave is macro policy by valuation. It can buy time, perhaps a great deal of time, but time is all it buys. Eventually, the technologies must deliver. Eventually, the productivity must arrive. Eventually, the promise must become reality. Because when consumption weakens, government strains, and net exports remain negative, only investment remains. And right now, investment is carrying the weight of the world. Flint West, signing off.